Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I think we are all here, so we can slowly start our today's seminar. So from my side, my name is Bartłomiej Krzysztof. I'm the head of the Richard Pipes Laboratory at the Institute of Political Studies of Polish Academy of Sciences, and it's a great pleasure for me to open this meeting. I'm really happy that all of you are with us today, and we are going to talk about long Jewish roads to safety. So I would gladly want to welcome Dr. Lidia Zessin-Jurek first from Czech Academy of Sciences. And I'm giving the floor already to Dr. Martyna Rusieniak-Karwat from my institute, who will be chairing and hosting today's evening. So Martyna, the floor is yours, and I'm listening carefully everything that you got to say.
Okay. Thank you, Bartek, for introducing me. Welcome, everybody. Good morning to some of the participants and our guests, and good afternoon to others. It's a great pleasure to be the moderator of today's meeting. This is a great and unique possibility to meet on one Zoom meeting, so great panelists from different parts of the world and the Mayor Landau's family. I think we should start now. We cannot wait a moment for latecomers because one of our guests, Professor Atina Grossmann, have to leave us soon. The central topic of our talk is Mayor Landau's book, A Lost World, the Galician Steppe and Siberia. Oh, this is this book. If anyone hasn't read it yet, I highly recommend it. I spent a whole last week reading this book and I couldn't put it down until I read it to the last page. So let me introduce my first speaker, Professor Atina Grossmann. She's professor of history in the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences at the Cooper Union in New York. She's the author of numerous publications, including many important books on the fate of European Jews during Second World War, including those saved by deportation to the Soviet Union. She will lead us into the theme of remapping Holocaust survivor and how Mayor Landau's book fits into it. Professor Grossmann, the floor is yours.
Oh, yes, thank you so much. And thank you, Lidia, for putting this all together and for all the work that you've done. I know it was not an easy path, and thank you, of course, also to George for this extraordinary partnership that developed. As I understand it, as I followed it between you and Lidia, which I think is, part of what we still have to manage to do, is to, find these stories and then find historians who are able and willing and have the languages and the historical knowledge to really work with the children, the descendants, those who have these treasures. And so I'm really, really, really so sorry that I can't stay. I have to leave like literally in like 5 minutes. I have to catch a plane. No, I will say that I've been to sort of, this is the third of 3 workshops that I've been to this month, all of them different, all of them in the Midwest. And in one way or another, they're all dealing with these questions of archives and memoirs and documents and letters that we are still finding and that are often, sometimes found by precisely the children or the grandchildren of those who produced them, and sort of talking about the question of what happens if an actual direct descendant works on that document, and what happens when a historian doesn't. At my last workshop, what happens, as in my case, working on my parents' story in Iran and India, the descendant is also the historian, which makes things even more complicated and challenging. So I mean, I think that first of all, I have to confess that I just fell in love with the story, and that George was able to bring to us about, you know, his father's life. I also, thanks to Lidia, had the privilege of reading parts of the manuscript that had to be left out, just because otherwise it would have become, you know, sort of impossible to publish, which in some ways it tells, you know, goes into much more detail about the part of the story that I'm particularly fascinated with, namely the time in Tehran, which we which I think I just want to say two things about that, and then I have to leave you, unfortunately. And I'm sorry, you are recording this, right? Okay, so I will have the
Yes.
benefit of listening and learning from all of you, because I mean this book, this project fits into, I think, two of the most important and exciting and productive trends in Holocaust studies that we are seeing right now. One, of course, is the move, which is now already well on its way, although we just have a, you know, wonderful new edition, which is to open up the story of survival and death and suffering, but also of life and resilience and agency during the Holocaust for particularly Polish Jews in the Soviet Union. That story, which for so long was so marginalized, and even if historians knew something about it, it was not visible in museums. It was not visible in the kind of public culture of Holocaust commemoration, right? And you know, with now, I think you know, with the work of people like Eliana Adler and Lidia and Marcus Nesselroth and so many more, Katarina, I'm just blanking on her last name.
Friedla.
Thank you very much, Katarina Friedla and Lidia. We now know so much more about, and the tale of that story of decision-making, of flight, of getting to the other side, crossing into the Soviet Union, and then the years when the Soviet Union is still technically at peace from 39 to 41, and then the years in special settlements, and especially the story of Jews in Central Asia, which fits into what has become the second, you know, sort of, I think, most exciting trend in Holocaust studies, as part of our sort of notion of globalizing the story, of recognizing that, you know, Jews fled to all parts of the globe, and that we need to do that globalizing, and to the degree that Jews also fled to parts of the world that we now call the global South, even though the geography doesn't necessarily work, that this is also part of a project of really decolonizing the history of the Holocaust, and recognizing the ways in which we have to look at these encounters among European Jews and people in the global South, who in one way or another find themselves in colonial or quasi-colonial spaces. And I think, you know, many of us would look at Central Asia as in and of itself a kind of colonial space, you know, within the Soviet Union, or quasi-colonial space. So I was, and then there is the story of all the transit points in between, right? Which in whether, you know, the Soviet Union, Iran, so many more. People are in Bolivia, people are in Cuba, people are in Kenya, people are, you know, even in Shanghai, literally, there's in the Caribbean, right? And so that is part of the story that we are now trying to tell, not only talking about the experience of the refugees, but also from the point of view of the host of a very already very very heterogeneous, including often Mizrahi Jews, local population. And what the Tehran piece tells us is about life as a Polish Jewish refugee in this capital city of what had become in 1941 occupied Iran, the sort of contradictory space of an autonomous monarchy, but then it's occupied by Britain, the U.S., and the Soviet Union in different ways. And it also, very importantly, and that's the last thing I'll say, it tells us a great deal about the role of the transnational aid organizations, in particular the JDC, the American Jewish Distribution Committee, which is not always portrayed in the most flattering manner. The story has some quite critical things to say about the ways in which aid organizations worked under these extraordinary pressures of war and the desperation of the refugees. So all this comes together, I think, in the story that George and Lidia together have produced. And I actually really hope that at some point we can also make available the longer version, because I think that's a part of the history that many people are very interested in. So thank you for having done this. I also think it's a real model for collaboration that's between the historian and the descendant, who in his own way is a historian. And that's something that we also should really think about, how that works, how we can make that work for more of us. And I leave you to your really wonderful discussion, and I look forward to hearing it on recording.
Thank you, Atina. Let me thank you for this generous opening. And if you are speaking about models, you are the model for us all, for the researchers on the topic, the founding mother of this field, I would say. Thank you so much for this opening, and safe flights, of course, right?
Yes, thank you, thank you. Keep. Yes, I'm happy to have helped. Bye.
I thank you too very much for your agreeing to participate in the meeting, and I wish you safe flight. So we can. I would like to introduce our other guests in the course in alphabetical order. Professor Ellen Friedman, welcome. She's an author, editor, and professor of English and Women's Gender Studies at the College of New Jersey, where she coordinated the Holocaust and Genocide Studies program. Several years ago, she wrote the book on the experiences of her family in the Soviet Union, entitled The Seven Family Holocaust Story. Probably Lidia could show us this book. Thank you. The first, our guest is Dr. Edyta Gawron. She is assistant professor of the Department of Jewish Studies at Jagiellonian University in Krakow. As a specialist in the 20th century history of Polish Jews, Holocaust studies, and post-Holocaust Jewish diaspora, she cooperates with various academic institutions and museums in Poland and abroad. The next, our guest is Dr. Daniela Gerson, or Gerson. She's associate professor of the journalism department at California State University in Northridge. She's a journalist and educator with a focus on community, ethnic, and participatory media. She reports on immigrant and multi-ethnic populations and investigate how digital media can promote civic engagement in underrepresented communities. The next, our guest is George Landau, the author's son. Welcome, George. It's a great pleasure for me to meet you, even only online. He was 7 years old when, together with his parents and brother Henry, was departed from Lviv to Siberia in June 1940. Next, our guest is Professor Maurice Samuels from Yale University, Program for the Study of Anti-Semitism. He specializes in the literature and culture of 19th century France and in Jewish studies. His new biography of Alfred Dreyfus was published in the Jewish Lives series in Yale University Press in February this year. The last but not least, Dr. Lidia Zessin-Jurek, how we mentioned, editor of Mayer Landau's memoir. She's from Czech Academy of Science in Prague, where she's a postdoctoral researcher and Poland expert in the Unlikely Refuge project of the European Research Council. And now let's move on to our discussion. First question, this of course goes to the editor of this book, to Lidia. I know that probably not everyone has read this book yet. Lidia, could you make a presentation of the book's content? It's 2 parts. Lidia, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Martina, for the invitation and organizing this event. I am really delighted that we are able to present a book written by Mayer Landau in this honorable company that you have just presented. A book which is containing first-hand testimony of events going back over 100 years, some of them, as well as those relating to the Second World War, of course, which is the main interest of today's meeting as well. And this is the book which has only now seen the light of day. It is also a great pleasure for me to speak after Atina Grossmann, who also kindly wrote the endorsement on the back cover of our book, and who was also who has this incredible feeling for the subject, and was one of the first, along with people like John Goldlust and many others, to start moving the subject into the focus of historians. It was more than a decade ago when it started. And they were doing this with the clear goal of giving this escape and deportation of Polish Jews to the East its proper place in the history of Holocaust period. And I would say successfully. As the book's editor, I would also like to welcome everyone who joined us online today. And I'm so happy to see so many friendly faces in the audience. And of course, our speakers who accepted the invitation, and among them, George Landau, who was joining us from California. And he also wrote a foreword to the book, which I highly recommend. It is available in open access. And there are really many ways in which I could begin to tell the story of this extraordinary scientific adventure that working on this book has been for me, especially that I engaged with it wearing various hats, as the Germans say. So this is the head of a historian of Poland, interested in the life of the Jewish minority, but also the head of a memory researcher specializing in the Holocaust and Gulag cultures of remembrance. Then a historian of forced migration and refugees, and on those titular long roads to safety. And finally, as our project progressed, also as a family friend and a big fan of George's passion and respect for the past and his engagement with the present as well. In fact, I would like to pick up where Atina also maybe left us, starting simply with how important this topic is, the topic of the refugees of Polish Jews, which started in 1939, and which I am also now trying in my current project to bring to even more light and more in its own terms. Stories like the one of Mayer Landau's are important as part of the Holocaust, as part of the Gulag history, and also in terms of how we understand the refugee movement, and today also in the memory of refugees and displacement. It is important internationally for Poland, of course, and I come from Poland, and here the memory of Jewish Siberians, as we would call them in Poland, is still marginalized in the national, let's say, frame. Despite the fact that these people have written, like Meyer Landau, but also Julius Margolin, Józef Henn, Aleksander Watt, Ola Watowa, Herling Grudziński, Ilana Maśler, Edward Koso, Julian Strykowski. I could really say more and more names here. So these people of Jewish origin wrote some of the most fundamental testimonies on the subject, and they wrote most of them in Polish. But the topic is also important, I would say, for Ukraine, for Russia, for Central Asia, for the European colonies in Asia and Africa that Atina mentioned, because these people traversed these regions after leaving the USSR. And this is all present in Meyer Landau's memoir. So these are the countries somehow that are the inheritors of the history of this particular type of asylum. And finally, this history matters for the lens of these people's final settlement, whether Israel, the USA, Australia, or any other place. In fact, I would like to, if it's fine, to share my screen to show you a slide or two, and you will tell me if you can see it well. Can you confirm?
Yes.
Okay, so as a historian of refugees, I should say that one of the central topics of Meyer Landau's testimony, that is the conditions of Eastern exile, the exile in the East, they varied. But for most people, the Soviet period was very harsh and far removed from any type of organized form of refugee relief. Rather, and Meyer Landau makes this very clear in his text, this Eastern exile meant oppression of various degrees, forced labor in the cold and starvation. As a result, the mortality rate was on average more than 5 times higher than in normal conditions. But what makes this story of survival so complex and difficult to narrate, although Meyer Landau managed to do it, is the fact that still this was a chance to survive for so many Jewish refugees from the German-occupied Poland. This 1939 escape from the Nazis far to the east did not guarantee survival and left deep psychological scars among refugees, but it nevertheless saved hundreds of thousands of lives when Western borders, we should add, remained largely closed or unreachable for the Jewish refugees. And recently, it is precisely the Holocaust scholars who have focused their attention on the USSR and the East more broadly as a site of refuge for Jewish, but also non-Jewish refugees fleeing the Nazi assault, and they work took in effect a shape of kind of concerted research into this Asian geography of survival. And only now this important fact, although previously it was not concealed, is finally taking on its proper significance. And the fact is that most Polish Holocaust survivors, and sadly we speak here only about 10% of the pre-war Jewish population of Poland, endured the war in the areas to the east of their homeland under oppressive Stalinist rule, which Atina rightly pointed out in one of her texts, only underscores how minimal the chance to survive the German occupation was. Our understanding of survivorship is changing as we speak also today. Thanks to the academic research, and Atina mentioned some names, I would like to show the covers of the books she mentioned, but also equally thanks to, I dare say, extremely rich testimonial literature of this group, which was in no way a coordinated project. On the contrary, it was usually a solitary endeavor, and I think George will tell us a little bit more about it, how his father wrote the book. And the number of these testimonies I like to say, reached a critical mass that no longer allows us to overlook the significance of the fact that these survivors went through refugees and deportation to Siberia, and then also their time in Central Asia. And everywhere there, they exhibited immense resourcefulness along the way. And now we also have this book by Mayer Landau retelling this experience. As you can imagine, I could really go at length about this story, the book, the author, but of many threads, let's say, I could go on weaving. I will simply try to tell you very briefly what will you find in this book that we put together with George and language editor Laura Garland, who did a wonderful job in translating the imperfect English of an immigrant to the US with occasional Polish or German syntax into the English, which is, let's say, more friendly and more in common parlance. So, and then I will hand it over to George to tell us how the manuscript came into being in the first place. So what Mayer Landau's book and testimony offers is not only the remarkable story of multiple displacements and refugees, if you wish, a Jew, kind of representative of a Jewish generation born late in the 19th century, in this case, born in Mościska, to be exact. Where is Mościska? I tried to locate it on the map. This is the blue point, and this is on the map of Austro-Hungarian Empire at the time. So this journey started in the shtetl and in the decision to leave, abandon the shtetl to start the secular education. Then it also pictures the need to leave Galicia because of the World War I, a refugee, and then a student life in Vienna. Then the search for a place to live in the 1920s and the 30s in various places in Europe, eventually choosing Poland and setting up, so Kraków to be exact, setting up a chemical company there. Here it is, the chemical company, Kopal, and here we have some leaflets and products. This was a paint factory. And then starting a happy family. Oh, and these are my favorite pictures. And we could choose many more. I'm sure some of you recognize here Kraków and Zakopane, maybe. So this happy family, this happy life, ended again with having to abandon this life and flee to the east in 1939. And this ended with deportation to Siberia. This time, these are no family photos, just to show you. And then the resourcefulness of the deported family, later also in Central Asia. Here there are some children and Kermine, where the family was staying. But this is already from the family album, George and his brother Henry, and their father working for Joint. So to end the story, we have also Mayer Landau traveling through India and Australia, giving lectures, and finally settling in the USA. So as you can see, the story in itself is remarkable, but what also counts, of course, is the way it was conveyed, the attention to detail and that the author put into these books. This kind of documentary care convinced me that this manuscript just had to be added to the literature of this generation and the literature of this experience. So this is in a very nutshell how, and here arriving to the safe port. Here, this is how the work, let's say, started and ended for me in the briefest of terms, but possibly much more interesting is is important is how the manuscript was born, let's say. And I think that we can ask our guest, George Landau, welcome George again, to tell us more about it. How does he remember how his father was working on the book?
Sure. Well, as usual, the first question is, can you hear me?
We
Yes.
can.
Okay, good. Well, my father never thought himself as a writer. However, deep in heart, he was a poet, really. In fact, he asked that on his tombstone that we put that he's a chemist and a poet. So we did that, my brother and I. And he started writing some poems, pretty much beginning with his grandmother, whom he loved dearly. And what happened was that one of our cousins, through a second marriage, got interested in the art, in reading the poems, and she created the art for them, published them, and then little by little, digressing, but that became the film, Lies and Miracles, How We Met, You and I. But going back to your original question of Papi's writing, he had when we arrived in 1945, when I say we, my mother, brother, and I, and were transported to Little Rock, Arkansas, we were an anomaly. No one had ever met people like us before. When my father came a year later via Australia, my parents settled in New York City, and that's where my brother and I went to schools and later on to universities. But my father had a very, very long commute, 2 hours in each direction. And he spent that time really doing the writing. So he would have, well, the commute was by buses, subways, trains, and cars, and whatever. But on every occasion, he used that time to write on big, or those yellow legal pads. Started with his memoirs, and then on weekends, and I was trying to find the actual typewriter. He had a little Hermes, or I think it was a Hermes, not an Olivetti, a little portable typewriter, and he would type with 2 fingers on that little thing, and then eventually turn over his sort of typed version to, in those days there were typing pools, people that would just type for others, and that's how the original manuscripts was created. Now, in those days, I don't know, maybe book agents existed, but Papi tried to get the book published, and the country was not ready for it, because for one thing, when we first came, people would say, "Oh, you were in the Soviet Union. How was it?" And we would attempt to tell them, but people thought that we were not telling the truth, because the Russians were still our allies. The war had just finished in Europe, but was continuing in the Far East, and people were not prepared to hear about anything negative about the Russians until a couple of things happened. One, Joseph McCarthy came along, and he saw communists in every corner of any rock that he could find. And the American public is kind of pendulum orientated, and all of a sudden things swung from being very pro Russia because of what they had helped us and the concept and so forth, to if you had anything to do, even in the margins of the Soviet Union, you were suspect. So I have for you, well, I was going to show you a few things, but one of them was the atomic, I worked in the atomic energy field, and the atomic energy people, before giving me a clearance, had to go back 20 years to where I lived. And I have this very long, which later on may unroll for you, scroll of all the addresses that they tried to find, including in Peugeot-Ignaris and all these places. So the pendulum swung, and the other thing that happened was that Solzhenitsyn wrote his book about the one life in the one day in the life of Ivan Dostoevsky. Well, when that book came out, it caused a big sensation combined with McCarthy. And then in the American mind, quote, they'd done Russia. You know, they were done. I mean, Solzhenitsyn said everything that needed to be said, maybe not by everybody, but certainly he carried a lot of weight. And so there was, again, no interest in the book. But my father kept writing because he was blessed with a very, very good memory. So he thought it was crucial for us, my brother and I, and others, to know what we went through, not necessarily to feel sorry for himself or others, but just historically. And then you, Lidia, if we get to how we met, match almost page for page with footnotes. You were able to research out everything that my father mentioned into over 400 footnotes, so that anyone that picks up the book can check the validity of what my dad had to say, including tracing names of people, politicians, locations, treaties, understandings. I mean, the footnotes themselves could be a massive book of history, never mind the dialect in between. Well, in any event, so my father then wrote the first book, which is called At the Lowest Level. And that was the area of pretty much what you showed, the factory, the life before, and our deportation, and then the miraculous way in which we got out into Persia, Iran. But then he wrote another book, which said Introducing Myself, because he remembered from about age 3, maybe 2 or 3, certainly by 4, when he started already going to a little school at Haydn. And that book, for you historians, I think is extremely valuable. Of course, it got cut back a lot, but as Anita said, maybe we'll bring it to life in more detail, because that covers an amazing period of time. A young man who was brought up in an Orthodox, progressive community. I mean, there were 3 synagogues in that tiny little village of 200 families. And his father was a president of one of the community. And when my dad decided he wanted a secular education, he was literally ostracized, literally was thrown out of not being able to attend services. His father had to give up his prestigious post of being president. But my dad persevered and went off to Vienna to be with his older sister, and started a secular education by learning German and participating in the life in Vienna. So he wrote that chapter, which is so valuable because it's that the Belle Epoque of Vienna with the student honor system of fencing and counting the scars they had on their faces as marks of honor of how many duels they fought. And I mean, he didn't, but he was challenged to one. And the studies, and then being drafted to the Hungarian army and being sent to Russia, where he was, and then he writes about that, and that part of it is in the book. But he also writes about the return and his work in Vienna as a student, helping other students attain places in the university and housing and so forth. And in between, getting involved with the Zionist organization, which he later on was president of. So I remember when we visited Mount Herzl together, he showed me, he said, Georgie, that's the desk that Herzl used and I used. I mean, it was the same office. So he was involved with her in the Herzl Zionist movement, and that is in the second book. The third book that he wrote was Out of the Whirlwind, and that covers in more detail the life in Persia, particularly the interworkings of the various communities, the Persian Jews, the Russian Jews that came years ago and did well and were Ashkenazi origin. The Persian Jews were Sephardic, the various denominations, how they interacted, the poverty among some of the Jewish people, I mean, the extreme poverty, and an incredible person called Rabbi Levi, who paraded around in what looked like a costume from a potentate play, but spoke no real English except, I mean, no language except Yiddish, but somehow was able to accomplish tremendous amount in educating and literally taking people out of caves and educating them and sending packages. So Papi devotes a lot of time to this man because he was very influential in my brother's education. And then he covers the other thing that's covered in that book is the ongoing anti-Semitism that the Poles brought with them, all 30,000 of them, from wherever the Anders army to Persia. And so that's an important chapter because here he was, we got out on our own, and yet the Polish army wanted to draft him, they had rejected him out of hand, because even though he was an officer in the Austrian army, because of being Jewish, they rejected him out of hand. But then in Persia, all of a sudden they were drafting him in, so he had to have special deferments by virtue of the fact that he organized the joint. And the joint was, I think, a something I need to mention that relief organizations don't get sometimes the credit they deserve. Well, in the case of the joint, Papi got to a point where you saw those huge bales of on the photograph of packages. You have no idea the complexity that it took to create a package. And so my dad redesigned the package so that if it ever arrived someplace in Siberia or Tashkent or wherever, that it was not consumed, that the content was sold on the black market. Well, the black markets in Russia were legal. You could go out and just stand with whatever you had, and people would make you offers.
Something went wrong. Please try again.
Whoops. So the point was that he redesigned the packages so that if they arrived, the content could be sold and extend the life of the recipient by something like 3 months, as opposed to consuming the crackers and whatever else the normal care package has, some candy and things. And they got up to 10,000 packages a month. Now, with a bonded warehouse, they created a bonded warehouse. They had their own post office, Persian post office inside. So that chapter, I thought, was incredibly important. And like any organization, it had some politics and some unpleasant things that he unfortunately had to write about, because otherwise his conscience would have bothered him. The Australian chapter is
George, could I stop you for a moment, because you started a very interesting threads to discuss very interesting threads from the book, and maybe we could also use the expertise of our guests and address one by one up
Sure.
to the point that you reached for now, and until the point in Australia, and then come back to this early post-war period in a second. Because what was very, very valuable, George, was that you told us that your father tried to publish the book, but the time was it was not a good time for that.
No. Yeah.
And
so,
he also confesses this in his work. And I think that Ellen Friedman will also tell us more about it in a second. But going like in a chronological direction, I wanted to come back to the fact that your father's testimony is distinguished by this rich pre-World War I prologue, which will interest anyone.
Very important.
Yeah, which it will interest anyone seeking knowledge about the lost world of the Galician shtetl, right? And this is what we meant giving the title of the book as well, and generally the life of East European Jewry. And this pre-World War I and also pre-World War II time period constitutes this first part of the book, the way we decided to put it together. And we thought it would be great to hear from the specialist on the subject of life of Polish Jews in Galicia. We have her here with us today. And one of the people also behind the excellent initiative, which is the Museum Galicia in Kraków, Dr. Edyta Gawron, about her thoughts on the Galician shtetl part of your father's memoir, and how does it fit into the picture that she already had. So maybe we could give the floor now to Edyta for a moment. That's fine.
Thank you, Lidia, and thank you all for having me here. It's an enormous honor and a pleasure to meet you all, but especially people who I've read in the book about and who contributed to the book that is such a well-read, and it's so rich with details and descriptions and it's an incredible historical source, which is served nicely covered. I mean, the word cover and also the detailed cover to the readers. So certainly one can talk a lot about what is presented in the book. And as Lidia asked me, is the element of the Galician shtetl, that it's one of the key elements of the memories, also very vividly described, but also filtered through some experience of living in other location than Galician shtetl. So in fact, what we get in these memories, it's the image of Galician shtetl with the hints of the look from the perspective of Lviv, of Vienna, of Krakow, and New York, and other locations. So we see this enriched image of Galician shtetl, enriched with nostalgia, but also enriched with the knowledge, which is not obvious in the memoirs from Galician shtetls. Very often the memoirs are kind of closed within the small world of the small town, and never moving beyond a certain perception of the life in the shtetl. So this is something that I really appreciated when reading the fragments devoted to Mościska, but also trying to look at the wider picture of Galicia. Most of my research is about Krakow, but also about the region of Krakow, Małopolska. But I have also in my academic dossier some works on other shtetls, mostly from Świętokrzyskie region. And here we see certain pattern. The author, Mayor Landau, is sharing his perception of the shtetl first through the family. So that's very interesting that he starts describing the shtetl through the eyes of the family, family members, his closest circle. And I must say that this is quite impressive and unique to some extent. Of course, we have descriptions of the shtetls with the large part devoted to the family, but he starts with it. So it's really interesting what kind of perception he chooses instead of starting with, for example, historical introduction of the shtetl or something else. So I found it really interesting, and the fact that the family serves as the case study for describing the society, for describing the community, a very wide spectrum of this Jewish community that not necessarily live in the shtetl, because some of the family members already migrated around Galicia. So this is the extra value that we not only see the Jewish community of Mościska, but we also see those who left Mościska, who made careers, who changed their lifestyle, who are considered outsiders, because the Jewish community of Mościska is described as very traditional one, very conservative. And this is another element that I really liked in this memoirs, that despite this conservatism of the community, we get this individual story of people who are the rebels of the community, like Mayor's mother, who is a progressive woman, who is going beyond the family tradition, who is trying to get the books that are not religious, that are not really orthodox, and they are considered something unacceptable in a good Jewish family. So this is something that is, on one hand, it's typical for Galician shtetls, but on the other hand, it's not always described and mentioned to the extent it was important for the communities, because each of the shtetls had its own rebel, someone who was trying to oppose the social norms, religious norms, and expectations of the elders. And this is greatly portrayed in these memoirs. So there are several elements that are really precious. And I think there's not enough time to describe all of them, but of course, I do not want to spoil the book. I hope that everyone who is listening would reach out for the book and read the memoirs, because they're definitely worth reading. But I would like to mention a few things that are relevant for this memoirs and the research on Galician shtetl, which is certainly a very, I would say, very sophisticated, and from insider's perspective, look at the Jews who worked for Polish aristocracy, the landowners. We have this chapter or fragment that is describing the relations between the local Jews, especially those who could help with business, and the landowners who were very often not present at the site and only visiting. So this is the continuation of the relation between Jews and landowners through the centuries, and certainly something important here. When I was reading the memoirs, I also had this vivid images attached, even not looking at the pictures. When I was reading the description of the shtetl, especially the market, and some customs, and the story of the watchman, I immediately referred to the Polish documentary, which is also available in English, Polin, Okruchy Pamięci, the compilation of pre-war film footage done by Jolanta Dylewska, the documentary that portrays the shtetls. And Mayor's Landau's stories fit into this image of the shtetl that is portrayed in this documentary. I would go even more. It would enrich the document because there are stories that are not mentioned. Also, there are stories that are not mentioned in the memory books. So I think these memories might serve as Mościska's memory book perfectly, at least a fragment of it. So I looked up also what is available about Mościska at the virtual shtetl, which is the portal by a Polish Polin Museum. Of course, this is the very popular source. It's not the research source, but I think it's worth to add the memories to the sources that are available, because if there are families trying to look at what is left from the shtetl, they might read the memories as well. And to add just a few more things, I think linguistic part of it, there was already something said about the editorial work, which is super precious, and the language is fabulous, but also this linguistic additions, like terms in all possible languages used by Galician Jews is present here. So whoever doesn't know the traditions can learn words in Yiddish, Hebrew, Polish, German, and even some Ukrainian elements are included. So this is an added value. And the relations with between the ethnic and national groups, political activities. So it's such a rich and complex image of the shtetl that one cannot imagine a better ambassador of Mościska among those who write. And just the last comment that I would like to make is the comment on migrations. Jews from Mościska migrating to other locations, especially the cities, and organizing or making the network of Jewish families, friends who migrated to various locations in Galicia, who in a sense exchange some tips, experiences, and this was something that was typical for Galicia. Almost every Galician Jew had some links, some connections in bigger cities and other parts of Galicia, and Landau's family is no different. So it's been a great pleasure to read the memories, to read the book. And I hope that I will have a chance to write a longer review of it with more details included, as my short time here is about to end.
Okay, thank you, Lidia, George, and Edyta for your introducing to this book. And George, thank you for show us more details from your family fights in Siberia and before Second World War. Now we can turn into another our guest. So I would like to ask Professor Maurice Samuels about the value of memory sources based on the example of Mayor Landau's memoirs. Professor, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. So first, let me say again, like everyone else, thanks to George and to Lidia. Thank you for inviting me to speak today, but also for working tirelessly to get this book published. And I followed many of the stages of that process. I had actually heard about the existence of the manuscript about 35 years ago when I was writing my senior thesis on the Holocaust, and George's daughter, Camille, who's here, who is my close friend in college, mentioned her grandfather had written something about his wartime experience. I had no idea it was so comprehensive and amazing. But I'm really glad that the book now exists in this handsome edition by Brill, not just for the family, who had the privilege to read it before, but now for researchers and scholars. So I was asked to focus specifically on the value of memoir sources. I'm sure I don't need to convince anyone here that the value is really immense. First of all, for historians who can use memoirs like this one, as well as recorded testimonies like those made by the Shoah Foundation and where I am, Yale's Fortunoff Archive of Holocaust Testimonies. They can use them in a variety of ways, including to corroborate facts or to fill in gaps in the historical record. And we heard a little bit about that. I doubt that much in the way of documentation exists really on Moshiska, certainly not to this extent. That town with its one main street that became a quagmire of mud during most seasons of the year. Landau describes everything with incredible specificity, but also, I think, with attention to larger historical forces at work within Polish society and within the Jewish community. And that's one of the things that I think makes it so special. Of course, historians have to approach memoirs with care because they can be subject, even more, I think, than many other sources, to bias and distortions. But with those considerations in mind, the memoir can yield a wealth of historical information, particularly if it's cross-referenced with other memoirs. Beyond mere facts, though, one of the most valuable kinds of information memoirs provide is a record of how historical events were experienced by those who survived them. And one of the moments that really struck me in the manuscript was on page 169, when Landau explains why in 1940, after the Russians had occupied his city, some Jews decided to return to the Nazi-occupied part of Poland rather than stay in the Russian-controlled zone. He describes how in that moment, Jews were scared that they would never be able to leave Russia if they stayed, and they heard reports that things weren't so bad yet under the Germans. He writes, and I quote, "Of course, nobody could foresee that everything would turn out differently, and that the Jews who succeeded in getting home went to their torture and their certain death." So what we get here is a record of thought processes, an explanation of why people made the choices they did based on various kinds of information that were available to them. And these are insights that less personal kinds of historical sources that just say, X number of people returned to Poland, X number of people didn't, they don't provide that kind of information. Of course, history is composed not just of events, but also of emotions and of affect. And we need to know not just what happened and when, but how it felt to be confined to a ghetto or to be deported to Siberia. Landau is on the whole a very composed writer. When he describes passing his parents' house, for instance, as he left for Siberia, he says only, "Neither they nor I knew on that day that we were parting forever." So he resists the temptation to imbue that moment with the emotion that he must have felt as he wrote that sentence years later. That in itself, I think, is highly significant for those of us who study how traumatic moments like that were experienced at the time and processed later. But there are also moments where Landau goes into great detail about the emotions he felt, such as the moment when the family is essentially arrested and told they will be deported to Siberia. And here I'm quoting again, it's a little bit long, but it's one of the kind of emotional climaxes of the memoir. It's still difficult to describe our feelings and emotions during this unforgettable night. I lost myself completely. I was filled with despair and couldn't coordinate my thoughts. I didn't know what to do next. Faced with such an extraordinary situation, I had the feeling I had failed completely, not being able to protect my family from such a disaster. I was thinking of committing suicide and slipped out in an unguarded moment to the bathroom. I had a razor blade in my hand, ready to cut my own wrists. I thought for a moment that this might protect my family from deportation. I thought the Russians confronted with such a situation would let my family stay. Then I thought, suppose they wouldn't. How much greater would the suffering of my family be compelled to go and to leave me behind? So reason prevailed, and I gave up my desperate plan. And then the next sentence, which really got me because it's so subtle, he says, fortunately, my wife Edyta was more composed. So it's scenes like that I think are the most valuable in memoirs because they do what histories can't do by bringing us into the heads of characters in experiencing traumatic events. They're kind of like novels, but they really happened. So it does what, those of us, I've tried to write sort of more popular histories, and that's what you're not allowed to do, is to go into the heads of characters and to imagine, attribute thoughts that you didn't know they had. But here we know that he had those thoughts. So that's incredibly valuable. I'll conclude by pointing to one other important value of memoir sources, and that's the way they form an archive for what we call the history of memory. And that's the subfield that studies how memories of events change over time and in relation to larger historical forces. And Landau's book is not just an account of what happened during the 1930s and 40s. It's also an account of how what happened in the 1930s and 40s was remembered later in the 1950s and 60s by a Jewish survivor who had started a new life in New York City. At the end of the book, Landau reflects on why the book is, as he says, rather late. He says, there are several reasons why time and again I had to postpone writing down my experiences and impressions of Soviet Russia. Initially, after arriving in the United States in 1946, I did not find the atmosphere here conducive to such a book. So scholars of the Holocaust have long been familiar with the way that survivors felt inhibited in the years after the war, the way they felt like nobody wanted to hear their stories. But Landau adds a specific new aspect to that account, excuse me, when he describes how people in the US especially were unwilling to hear anything bad about Soviet Russia in the immediate aftermath of the war. He writes, I found out quite quickly that people preferred to stay with their already established views of Soviet Russia as an ally. My story was quite a strain on their minds because it forced them to revise their views. But of course, we can also ask, what then changed to allow him to tell this story and to tell it in the way he did? His memoir provides not only a record of World War II then, but also of the Cold War and of changing American attitudes towards the Soviet Union. Its publication today, at a time of renewed fear about anti-Semitism in the US and around the world, constitutes yet another stage in that process. It testifies to the way that the history of the memory of the war continues to evolve and to take on new meanings and new relevance in our own time. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Samuels. And now my next question is to Professor Ellen Friedman. How do you recall the moment you wrote your book? We showed your book at the beginning or meeting, which tells the story of your parents' escape, their survival in Siberia. How has our knowledge changed since then, and what does Mayor Landau's books add to this picture? Floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for inviting me to this panel and also giving me this wonderful new memoir about this Soviet experience. I want to first say that I hadn't realized that this panel was part of the Richard Pipes seminar until I read the announcement. I have a connection to Richard Pipes through my daughter, Rebecca Friedman, who's now a professor of Russian history at Florida International University. She worked as Richard Pipes' research assistant in the 1990s, so I was very pleasantly surprised to be invited to participate in a seminar named for him. So I was asked to join this panel because I wrote a group memoir called The Seven, a family Holocaust story about how my family and some of their friends, all 7 of them from Warsaw, survived World War II together in the Soviet Union. Well, 6 of the 7 survived and lived out a natural lifespan. So I'm a retired English professor and the founder and former director of the Holocaust and Genocide program at the College of New Jersey. And actually, Barbara Krasner, who's on this call, hang on, I need to confirm something about my language here. Okay, all right. Teaches in that program, so I was really glad to see her here. That was also a nice surprise. So my entry into this discussion is both as an academic and as a memoirist of this Jewish experience of survival. I myself was born in Frunze, now Bishkek in Kyrgyzstan, to starving parents on the run from Hitler. As this audience knows, of approximately the 10% of Eastern European Jews who survived World War II, most survived in the Soviet Union. And one of the ironies of this story of Jewish survival is how little public currency it has as a Holocaust narrative. Ruth Kluger wrote so beautifully that any Holocaust narrative that does not conform to the familiar framework of the Holocaust, which usually includes concentration camps, is largely ignored. And as my father said to me, and as Meyer Landau writes in his book, compared to the concentration camps, this Soviet survival story just doesn't come close. It's still simply the wrong Holocaust story. For instance, just a couple of weeks ago, I gave a talk to a large international group of Yiddish speakers about the Soviet experience, about my book. Here's what's ironic. Although a dozen people, with many more wanting to speak before we ran out of time, said they had relatives who survived this way, they had not heard this story outside of their family circle. So there must be hundreds of thousands, and maybe millions by now, of people who have this history in their family, yet these stories remain largely in the private realm, and increasingly, thanks to the work of Lidia and others, in the scholarly realm, increasingly in the scholarly realm. So in our email exchange, Lidia asked me what has changed in our perception of survival in the USSR. And I think very little if you include public understanding of the Holocaust. But I think much more among Holocaust and World War II historians. So scholars have made this their field of expertise, something that's new and are really promising. And they're producing books and articles in a steady stream. There could be more, of course, since the Soviet experience is so varied.
but I'm really grateful to these historians' impressive productivity. I really enjoyed Meyer Landau's book. First, I noticed what was familiar to me. So many of the elements that are also included in my family story. For instance, the awakening to the dangers of the Nazi invasion of Poland, the failed effort to convince loved ones to leave German-occupied Poland, the precarious and dangerous escape to the east, the navigation of the Soviet system, the trucks, boats, trains, and more boats, trucks, and trains before arrival in the Soviet hinterland, the perpetual forests, the freezing cold of these places. In Landau's case, the Perm region in the Ural Mountains. In my case, Nufchim in Komi, which I can still find on the map. The liberation of Poles in the prison settlements when Hitler broke the Hitler-Stalin Pact and invaded the Soviet Union. The anti-Semitism of General Anders' Polish army. The flight to the south in the USSR, in my case, Kyrgyzstan, and in Landau's Kazakhstan, among other locations. The enormous distances covered, the numbers of nationalities, ethnicities, and languages they had to negotiate to survive. The lice, typhus, malaria, dysentery they suffered under Soviet deprivations, and the corruption and bureaucracy. I was also tickled by the similarities in some of the coincidences in these epic journeys. In both cases, siblings separated by an indifferent Soviet bureaucracy were reunited by pure chance in a remote marketplace years later, years after they had been separated. I was also struck by how identical some of the anecdotes were. The Russians mistaking nightgowns for dresses, and their obsession with watches, buying and wearing as many as possible. You know, just these anecdotes about the encounter between East and West. Landau's book also made me think about how improvisation, opportunism, and as always in Holocaust narratives, just dumb luck propelled their survival. Michael Rothberg, Holocaust scholar, writes about Jean-François Lyotard's idea of petit récit in describing the work of Holocaust writer Charlotte Delbo. Petit récit refers to the preference for smaller and more individualized stories. It's a rejection of master narratives that generalize experience through all-encompassing cultural and historical truths, such as the familiar Holocaust master narrative that Kluger talks about that I referred to earlier. Each individual story, each petit récit, offers a new perspective and enlarges our sense of this historical period. It allows historians to consider not only this different Holocaust story, but to contemplate the forces that drive the individuality of the experiences of Jewish survival in the Soviet Union. So, despite the similarities I noticed, Landau's story is so different from my own family's. In my family, they were tailors, and none even went to high school. Landau feels himself part of the intelligentsia. He's a scholar with a privileged European education. Some of his family's successes during their exile were prompted by important people he knew, contacts he had, and financial resources. Having access to both our stories, along with many others, historians can contemplate the effects of class, gender, marital status, age, education, geographies, and many other factors in the options these survivors had and the choices that they made. Also important is who is telling the story, when, and why. Landau tells the story of himself and his family at a remove of some decades. This delay for him is positive, giving him objectivity and, as he says, a way to tell the story that is representative. In his eloquent preface, he dedicates the book to his parents. The book is a chance to live for a while in the past, to recollect a tumultuous, traumatic time in tranquility, to paraphrase Wordsworth, and to make sense of it. His is a first-generation narrative. Second-generation storytellers have other varied responses. Their memories are, first of all, inherited rather than experienced. Some feel they are hostages to these memories, captives to a past they have only been told about. They feel guilt and responsibility for these memories. But each perspective matters and adds to what we know. If enough of these petit récits, individual stories, circulate, it may expand how the Holocaust is held in the public imagination and thought of less reductively, less as a single idea. And I'm really eager, so very eager to hear the third generation perspective from Daniela, which I think follows my talk. Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much, Professor Friedman, for your great comments and bright. I see a lot of memoirs we need or must to publish or translate from Yiddish into Polish or English to for a bright audience. So as a final comment, I would like to ask Professor Daniela Gerson, like a third generation of Siberia survivors, to take the floor and share your thoughts from the reading Mayor Landau's memoirs. Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and it's a joy to be here. Like George and I think some of the other Landaus, I'm on California time, so I'm just waking up while the rest of you are winding down. You know, from my bio, you could have told I'm an immigration journalist. I focused on migration issues throughout my career. I've reported for the LA Times, for dailies in New York. And then I focused a lot on community engagement. I always knew this family story. And I had reported on, you know, I'd started reporting in some ways on my grandparents when I was in 8th grade, and I'd read Lucy DeWitt's and how she'd written like about how all these groups had survived in the Soviet Union, but I saw very little representation of this story. And it sort of threaded through my personal history. But then it sort of exploded with two things that happened. One is I met my wife in Los Angeles, and the third time we were just hanging out, we discovered that we were both from Zamość. And when I heard that her grandparents had been from Zamość and they'd fled in 1939, I was like, oh, were they in Siberia? Because of course, if you survived from Zamość, which I don't have to tell this group, you survived in Siberia. And she said, yes. And I was like, well, were they in Uzbekistan? She's like, I don't know. They never talked about it. Her family had ended up in Israel. My family eventually ended up in the States. We're very cliche in the memoir-driven stories in that her family was not talkers. My family were talkers. And we started to dig into this story. And in the meantime, both of our fathers had died and our kids were born in between. And this question of what comes next for these stories, particularly with a generation which has no connection to what happened. You know, our kids will never hear a Yiddish accent. If they do, it won't be the Yiddish accent we ever heard from Poland. They will never have a direct contact to what happened. So we started to sort of excavate the story. And one element is that both of our families ended up in Lviv. And we know this, I did find a couple of things from her family. Actually, there's so many books here, but I have one of these here. For the historians here, anyone recognize these? Really.
Yeah, it's a diary, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a little memory book, right?
Memory
Like
book where your friends would write something. for you.
yeah. And actually, you see in some of the Sibirak ones where they took them to, the non-Jewish Sibiraks took them to Kenya and elsewhere. And so this showed me that my wife's grandmother had been in Lviv. They never talked about it, but she has some passages from Lviv. And then there was one great uncle who did do one testimony. I had 15 hours of testimony from my family, 1 hour from my wife's family from a great uncle. And he didn't want to talk because he came to the US by lying about his age. One of the things, I've noticed a couple of themes that have come up. One is this migration story. And how is this story a migration story? So I started, I wanted to just talk briefly about how this book, and particularly in terms of the Lviv or Lvov at the time section, really illuminates. I've spent the past 2 years reading the Ringelblum archives, documentation, Alexander Vaught, like a lot of it's been mentioned of incredible resources on Lviv. But even with all of those, I found in this memoir so many details. And it comes at the time where my book is coming out next May. I'm in the editing process right now. I thought I had most done. And then there are all of these evocative, specific details. The memory is just incredible. And I wanted to just bring up a couple. One I loved was this idea of women. And Maurice brought up what happened in this crisis at the time of deportation. And that idea of committing suicide, that he just couldn't handle how horrific it was. And then the mother figure is coming in and the women standing up. And there was sort of two very, both descriptive and analytic in terms of the shifting roles of women, both because in the Soviet Union, and it comes up again and again, you saw for the first time women in uniforms, but then also the sort of saw that, here's a quote, they were stronger and more capable than men in coping with the most difficult situations. The woman took over, did all the thinking, managed the family affairs, and quite frequently because they became responsible for keeping the family alive and feeding everyone. And I think in terms of one of the challenges of memoirs is I've listened to 5 different relatives of my family and how they survived. Almost everyone was the savior, right? Like each of them, it was like my uncle Moishe, who was the strongest. It was my grandfather Matal, who was the smartest. It was my grandmother who sewed. Like each memoir, they're the protagonist, they're the hero. And I will have definitely drama with one cousin when this comes out because his father is not going to be the hero as he was told. But I did think it made me think about the role of my grandmother, who I often saw as someone full of fear and regret and weak. But as I was listening to the testimonies, I did see the way she helped lead the family. And this made me think of it in new ways as well. A second, and I'm just going to bring up 3 themes because I realize it's getting late. The second one is the smuggling trade. So as an immigration journalist, we talk a lot about coyotes who take people over the border from Mexico. There's always someone who is smuggling. Whenever there's a border, there's a way through. And I thought the specifics where he really broke, and I'd heard, I think in Eliana Adler's book and elsewhere, there was a little bit of mention of smugglers. And then my grandfather's testimony talks about how a cousin became a smuggler and brought his father back, and his father was killed. But here's the description of peasants from the border villages became guides who smuggled people at night through the demarcation line for a certain agreed upon fee. It was a 2-way traffic. Some guaranteed the crossing and others didn't. Some insisted on being paid in advance. Some agreed for half the pay up front and for the rest to be paid after the crossing. It's almost like he's a reporter here. Like he's really done research beyond most of the memoirs, which are really, focused on a specific personal experience. I feel like it really broadens an understanding in a different way than any of the testimonies or even the memoirs I've read before. And then there's also just some beautiful writing. I feel like, on the train, I love the description of the deportation train where it describes this pregnant woman and the husband races up at the last moment and there was still happiness in the sea of human misery. I also loved the sort of insight into the discussions happening on the train. And I listened to a bunch of also memories of the train and read a lot of memoirs. And I thought this brought it, like one thing I'd never heard before was this splitting between the bourgeois and then the working class, and say like how they sort of self-segregated within this boxcar. And this could just be specific to this boxcar, but I thought it was very interesting, and that the bourgeois would surely suffer now, and that it brought these class divisions that were being reversed in certain ways and played out on the boxcar. So, I mean, these are just 3 examples. There's so many others. I've been trying to figure out, in terms of this decision to return to Nazi-occupied Poland, how it happened, but also just the specifics of passportization, registration. And I feel like I was able to like finally get each step down, I think, and because he describes it in such specific terms. So I think in terms of, the final thing I'll say is how does this move forward? And, Lydia, you started with this amazing slide of all of this historical work, which has been incredible, and these memoir work. There is also the historical, there's both memoirs like mine, which hopefully, I mean, I've sold it for it's for Hachette. It's a mainstream publisher. Hopefully it will reach a broad audience, God willing. But then there's also We Were the Lucky Ones that you described in terms of the Hulu show and novel that came out, which was based on research. And one of the things that Georgia Hunter, who wrote in her acknowledgments, was that the Shoah Foundation memoirs were like gold to her. And you can see how she used those descriptions. And having something like this that blends both personal recollection, but is also more reported and then is edited by a historian, brings a sort of level that for someone like me can be used as details as well as analysis and putting things into perspective. So I really appreciate all of your work. I appreciate being part of it. And thank you.
Professor Gerson. Thank you very much, our all guests for all answers and to joining us. So now we have like 20-25 minutes time for discussion with so great audience. If anyone wants to ask a question or comment, please raise your hand. Maybe. Do we have any questions to our guests? Is unique? Okay, Camille, could you unmute yourself and ask a question?
First of all, thank you to everyone, and my connection to George Landau is probably clear. I'm a daughter, along with my sister Florence here. First, I just have to say I was so moved by the reflections shared by people here, and I'm wondering if there is a way in which you've seen children feel shy about the value of what is shared by a family member. Clearly, it has value that you put into context here, historical context, etc. And I'm wondering if you've encountered something that I can speak to personally, which is a sense that, well, it's important, but it's just my family, if this makes sense. And how you've encountered that either for yourselves or overcome it in your research.
I could speak to that first, reverse, and then I think that's why it's so important what these historians have done, because it felt like a very unique, specific story in terms of the survival via the Soviet Union. You did not see it in Holocaust museums. You did not see it in the specific literature. And so I think what the historians have done in terms of shifting the narrative, but then how do you bring that to the broader public is a question. And then also, I think what was outlined here in terms of like why it matters as a broader story. And so with that, so that it's not such a, just a specific familial story, but has broader ramifications.
Ellen, would you like to add something from you? Because I remember you writing about the right to speak. I remember this from your book very clearly.
I thought a lot about whether I had a right to tell the story, and basically I waited until most of the principals had died before I wrote it. I was director of women's studies for much of my career, so I was very conscious of myself as a woman writing the story. And which reminds me, I wanted to say to Daniela that there are ways that women write these Holocaust stories that are different than the way men write these stories. So if you think about, for instance, Charlotte Delbo, it's a communal story. It's never just her story, but she writes in the voice of many women who were in the camps with her. My book, I interviewed as many in my family as I could, and I let them speak. And each chapter is a different a different member of the seven. My voice is definitely in there because what interested me was the impact of these stories, or one of the things that interested me was the impact of these stories on subsequent generations. I was thinking about my grandchildren as well, my daughters and my grandchildren. So I don't know. I feel I've lost the thread. What question was I supposed to be answering?
You nearly made me cry, so you definitely answered something.
Okay, great.
Well, if I can be rude and chime in, I think that given what is happening now, you as historians and spokespersons and writers and influencers almost have an obligation to talk about in any way, shape, or form, whether it be through your participation in seminars or lectures, and warn people, because when 8 years ago this film called Lies and Miracles came out, based on my father's first book, I used that as a warning to people to say, pay attention, because of what may happen to our fragile system, without ever conceiving that Putin would march into. And I mean, little things such as my passport, my birth certificate says Lvov, Poland, and my latest passport says I was born in the Ukraine. I mean, you have an obligation, as I do, to really go out of our way and educate, particularly the younger people, and I mean the children of Daniela, who that generation, because they are, I would use the word ignorant in the academic sense of the word, and they need to know, and they don't get that information at all. They don't even learn about World War II until high school, and yet they're voting age. So I'm urging, and I'm back on the circuit giving talks and things. And by the way, maybe because they're running out of candidates, I am a candidate for the Shoah Foundation interview, which is going to come up, because my brother and I never thought of ourselves as Holocaust survivors. We thought of ourselves as survivors of the Soviet system, and which is operating at full strength now, except instead of us cutting trees or our fathers, it's the Ukrainians that are cutting the trees, and the Ukrainian children that are being adopted, quote unquote, by Russians. So things are happening in pretty much the same way, and those cattle cars still exist. So that's why I wanted to chime in to urge you to keep doing what you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Thank you. And we do have more questions, right, Martina?
Yes, we have a question from Barbara Krasner, if you want unmute your voice.
Sure. So thank you, everyone on the panel. I found it very, very inspiring. What this memoir does for me is that it brings together two different narratives from my family. One is the migration from Nazi-occupied Poland to Uzbekistan. And Lidia is somewhat familiar with that because we have a common interest in, I won't say this as well as she will, but Ostov Mazowiecki, where my grandmother was from. But also, my other grandmother was from a Galician shtetl, Kozlov, in the Tarnopol district. And her brother, her only surviving brother, was deported to Siberia. And I don't know anything about it. His daughter won't talk to me. And she will not give me permission to access any JDC or highest files. She said that he said nothing. He died in 1980, so I never really had access to him. But I'm really curious, since the story that Meyer Landau tells us that the family went to Siberia, but in this case, only my grandmother's brother went. His wife and daughters did not, and they were later killed either by bullets or Beljets. I'm not sure which. There is no Yisker book for that Galician shtetl. So I want to try to piece together a history of it. So I am anxious to get my hands, eager to get my hands on this memoir so that I can use it for myself, but then also possibly bring it into the classroom. So it's just a thanks. It's not a question.
Thank you so much. If I can just say a word about it, because you pointed out an important aspect of this memoir as well. What is special, quite special about Meyer Landau's recounting is, among other things, the fact that this is a book about family, and there are relatively few of these. The vast majority of published memoirs are by people who survived in the East without families, as young refugees and deportees, simply because they were the most numerous as a refugee group. And we would have to also say that forced migration, and this one covered like thousands of kilometers, it's often an age-selective process, right? And also the most vulnerable, so the older people, children, and sometimes also women are less represented in some of these movements. And although we do not have official statistics here, the vast majority of the refugee deportee accounts that, and I have read like almost 1,000 of them, report situations in which young people fled alone. And here, in referring to the hardships of the family, is where we can find Meyer Landau's also more tender reflections in the otherwise rather matter-of-fact account, you will agree with me, of his family's refugee odyssey. And I think Maurice mentioned some of these moments. This was an excellent choice of quotations. These more emotional passages concern his wife, Eda, and sons, who were uprooted from their normal lives and not complaining also about their hardships. On the contrary, showing the strength and resilience. So thank you for bringing this up, again, the family aspect of the memoir. And we are maybe collecting questions from I would say from Florence, and then from Ellen.
Thank you. I'm Florence. I'm George's other daughter. So Daddy, actually, you just confirmed that what I remember to be true, that it was only last year that I made the statement. Well, I should say that my whole life I've been saying, well, we're Polish Jews. We were taught very early that we're not to say we're Polish Jews, because the Jews were treated very differently. And that the story that I told was that my father and his family survived the Holocaust because they were taken by the Russians and sent to Siberia instead of taken by the Germans and put into concentration camps. And that's the story I've been telling my whole life. And only last year did my father say, no, Florence, that's not true. We just we survived. This happened because of the war. I said, yeah, but it was the Holocaust. He goes, no, it was just the war. I said, but it's because you were Jewish. He says, no, there were other people with us too. And I was completely dumbfounded by that. And I said, really? That's the way you see it? He says, well, let me ask Henry. Let me ask Henry how. So he called up his brothers, and I was there as Henry. When you tell the story, do you say that you survived the Holocaust? He goes, no, Georgie, it's just that we survived the war. And then I checked in with my sister and my brother. So what story have you been telling? And so I'm still a little dumbstruck by this. And I wonder whether he has the right to have his belief and his experience and tell the story how he tells it, but I'm still surprised. And I just wonder whether part of it is that it just has not been reflected in culture and society, and it hasn't been taught, and that story is not part of Holocaust museums, and we're only just starting to reveal it. So I just have to share that. It's just, here we are. I was like, okay, they are talking about it as if it's the Holocaust. I am hearing that. And then I had this thought, and again, my father said, no, it wasn't the Holocaust. It was just, the war. And so I'm still trying to piece together these two things, but I really do think that part of it might be because as he grew up, it was not acknowledged. His story was not allowed to be told. The US was not ready for it. It was never shown in books. It was not taught in schools. It wasn't shown in Holocaust museums. So I think it might be a reflection of that, but I'm still just pondering that difference. Thank you.
I feel I've had the same questions, and I think Lidia can probably speak most clearly to this, but I think there's that complexity. And this is one of the reasons the story isn't well known, is because on one hand, it is a Holocaust story. They fled because they were Jewish, but what happened to them was not because they were Jewish. And
Daniela, I'm not so sure about that. I think it is a Jewish story. My people fled Warsaw, where there were, they were part of a community, a large family group, because my uncle was in the Polish army, and he saw the might of the German fighting machine, and he ran home and he said, we got to get out of here. And the people who went with him, most survived. 6 out of 7 survived, and the 7th survived only because she went back. Didn't survive because she went back for her lover. So I think it's very much a Holocaust story.
Clarify, I wasn't saying it's not a Holocaust story.
Okay, and about Jews.
That they fled. They were Jewish, but when they were subject to deportation from the Soviets, they weren't specifically targeted in that deportation for being Jewish. I'm turning it over to the historians but I hadn't realized that non-Jews were deported. I think I took it a little bit as a story of this was only subject.
Stalin didn't want Poles on the border. Because he was afraid of spies or whatever, ideas he had about Poles on the border. So he gave them a choice. Either they could become Soviet citizens, join the army, and fight with the Soviets, or they could go back to Poland. And if they didn't want either of those two options, then they would be deported they would be banished. That was their official sentence. Their official sentence was banishment. And yes, it's true, there were people other than Jews, but the reason that there were so many Poles on the border on the Soviet side is because it was Jews fleeing Hitler. I believe, the historians can correct.
I'm a historian, so I will just say a short word here because I feel obliged a little bit. Well, in my opinion, we will never agree, right, on what it really was, and we don't have to. And this lack of collective consensus, let's say, and mnemonic likeness of the groups or people, individuals remembering this experience and the descendants should not be viewed as a deficit or a problem. Instead, I would say that this multiplicity of interpretations and feelings about this past testifies to the kind of mnemonic prowess of you and as individuals who, in the midst of so many social determinants that you are in, political, social, psychological, have managed to retain some, if limited to some extent, capacity to make your own kind of choices regarding which memory path to identify with and to follow. And this sometimes includes opposing the prevalent organizing logic of victimhood along some ethno-national collectives, like in Poland, for example. So I think you just did not surrender your role as choosing actors. And I think the task of historians and researchers working with witnesses and their children is to avoid the temptation to impose our interpretations, this kind of epistemological violence, and to allow you, people who were victims, to tell and preserve the story according to your chosen narrative, because you feel this is the one. And I think that we can give even some recommendations here. It would be to work on securing the conditions for memory pluralism, especially for refugee and minority communities also today, as they are entering their respective majoritarian frameworks of social memories, and to ensure that the social framework kind of favors the most natural ways rather than forcing limited choices about how to remember the difficult past. So we don't have to agree, and I think each of us is right here, if I can say something.
Okay, we have two more people with questions. Dr. Gautam Chakrabarti, if you could.
Yeah. Dziękuję bardzo. Thank you, Professor Rushinia Korvat. Now, I was just listening to this, and first of all, it was wonderful to read parts of the book. Thank you so much for this great work, Lidia. And it was very inspiring. And what struck me is that this book is a bit of a global microhistory, not only of an intersectional moment, as Lidia was just also elaborating, an individual life, which is also a tapestry of a broader historical moment, right? I am reminded of my intervention. I didn't want to ask a question, but the discussion in the last 10 minutes made me think of how minority histories in general and Jewish history specifically, cutting through the Eurasian landmass, offers these moments and possibilities of multiple interpretations. For example, if you look at the histories of East European Jews who were escaping either the Holocaust, or if you go back a little earlier, the Bolshevik Revolution, people who are migrating to Shanghai to escape the Holocaust, people who are migrating to India through Iran. And one of my projects has to do with Eastern Europe, people of Eastern European Jewish descent who found their way to India during the Second World War, from Poland, from Eastern Europe, through Persia. So one of the interesting things that happens is in India, people of German Jewish descent, and I have an article on a German Jewish, he was from Silesia, so in that sense, German Polish Jewish literature professor called Alex Aronson, who went to Cambridge, and from Cambridge went to teach in Rabindranath Tagore's University near Calcutta. So one of the interesting things that happens to all German Jewish persons in India in the late 1930s, early 1940s, is they're interned with other Germans in British internment camps as enemy aliens. Now, one of the problems of this is that many of these other non-Jewish Germans were actually National Socialist sympathizers, if not actual full-blown National Socialists themselves. So in many cases, the experiences of these German Jewish people were that of a double jeopardy. So obviously fleeing from National Socialism, but then also fleeing from British agglomeration into this German entity. So many of these people, Alex Aronson has written about this, and he says he has a very mixed understanding of what he was escaping from. And there is this element of escaping from European, pan-European anti-Semitism, and not just, National Socialist German anti-Semitism. So I just wanted to put that out in response to what Lidia just said. Thank you.
Thank you, Gautam. That's excellent. And also kind of reconciling all of us here. And there is Edyta, right? Waiting to...
I think will be last question or comment because we don't have time. As we see, we can make a long discussion about this book, and in the beginning, in the origin of this book. This is very urgent book for me, not only like memoirs, but also like textbook, because it's a lot of description of the history background for people who doesn't know the Second World War history in the Soviet Union with the fate of Polish Jews in Soviet Union. Okay, Edyta, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I just have two comments. One is about the identity and what you shared, your doubts, how to define yourself, how to identify yourself. And Lidia was generously saying that it's up to you how you define yourself. But I think I would like to mention the immediate post-war situation and the discussions between the Polish Jews who survived in Soviet Union and the Polish Jews who went through the ghettos and the camps in the German-occupied territories. And certainly at that time, those who survived the German-occupied territories were telling the Jews from the eastern territories, you didn't go through the hell we went through. So it was like creating two categories of survivors. And I think this sort of imposed certain narrative of the Jews who survived in Soviet Union. And I'm sure some of you are aware of this, but if not, I think this might also have also created some situation in which there was no choice how to define your identity through the survival experience. So maybe now is the time to talk about it differently and to discuss how we feel, but also what was the historical implication of the escape to the Soviet Union. It was because of the Holocaust. So at the end, it was Holocaust survival. So that's the first comment I wanted to make. And the second, it's more personal. I envy those memories also for the fact that part of my family went through Soviet Union, and I do not have memories. I do not have any written sources. So it's reading it, it's like filling the gap of my family history. So really appreciate it because it's not granted and it's not given to everyone. Thank you.
And Edyta, this was so beautiful toward the end of our conversation. Martina, will you allow me to have a last word?
Yes, of course, if you
okay, because to be honest, I need to say something. I mean, I am at loss for words to express my gratitude for the collective wisdom and also commitment that we have been able to bring together in this room. The academic analysis in each case was accompanied by this kind of certain tenderness, right, of gaze on this very book, and also its storytelling, which is probably also due to the way Mayor Landau recorded his life. We should also realize that the memory of this complicated refugee and deportation story that we are discussing here has no dedicated physical space for itself. And I think this is part of the problem we are discussing here. There is no center, documentation center, there is no monument, no museum to this particular story. So some artifacts or snippets of information can be found in some of the museums, Polin Museum in Warsaw, the USHMM in Washington, or Białystok Museum of the Memory of Siberia in Poland, but they function always as on the margins, like of the main stories that these places tell. Meanwhile, we can see today that families, and I visit many more, but such as George Landau's family, they not only have manuscripts in their drawers, but sometimes they also have mini archives from which an exhibition could be created on the subject. Because although it has been elaborated in academic literature, this story is still unknown to the wider public, and that's why we are not sure how we should be speaking about it in public. And I must say that my interviewees do not always know where to go with their precious mementos, memories, in the sense that no memory culture really claims them. And this makes these family archives also very precarious collections. And I wanted to point out that. And I hope this meeting was both informative for us, but also has created new questions, right? And among the audience, and also those people who will listen to us to the recorded video. And it has also created more awareness on the lives of Polish Jews and the complicated Jewish roads to safety in the first half of the 20th century. Because these entangled life trajectories took us today to many unexpected places, geographically, methodologically, and also sometimes, as you could see, emotionally. And they kind of underline the need to continue interdisciplinary research and reflection on refugees also in general, on those intertwined stories of persecution and rescue. And here the displacement of Polish Jews provides tremendous material for study. And among colleagues and witnesses of this story, like the ones who joined us today, we are on the right path, and I'm very much assured and encouraged. And I thank you so much for participation, even though it took more than 2 hours. You were really brave and very, very generous with your presence and comments.
Okay, thank you, Lidia. I would like to thank you all for participation in our seminar, Zoom seminar, on behalf of the Richard Pipes Laboratory at Polish Institute of Political Studies, Polish Academy of Science. And it was very interesting and powerful and fruitful discussion for me. And I would like to say goodbye or meeting in another seminar, or I invite you for another seminars in Richard Pipes Laboratory. Okay, have a nice day or evening today, and bye-bye.